Alternative Radio presents Conversations with Noam Chomsky, Part 2. Noam Chomsky is an internationally renowned professor of linguistics at MIT. He's the author of numerous books and articles on United States foreign policy, international affairs, and human rights. The New York Times has written of him, judged in terms of the power, range, novelty, and influence of his thought, Noam Chomsky is arguably the most important intellectual alive. In October 1988, he gave the prestigious Massey Lectures for the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation. A month later, he was honored with the Kyoto Prize, the Japanese equivalent of the Nobel Prize. I interviewed Noam Chomsky at his home in Lexington, Massachusetts. Noam, you frequently use the term elite. I think a working definition would be useful.
Well, there are various segments of the groups that we ought to call elites. In the first place, there are those who are in a position to make decisions which affect, crucially, what happens in the general society. So that would include political decisions over investment, over production, over distribution, and so on. Then there are the groups that are in managerial positions with regard to the political and economic institutions, so the state managers, the corporate managers, and so on, and also with regard to the ideological institutions, so the top editorial positions and other positions of control within the media and the journals, etc. These groups, which are in fact closely interconnected and share not only directly interconnected and interlocked, but also share a common set of values, associations, belong to the highly privileged class, are generally quite wealthy. These groups determine the basic framework of what happens in the society based on their power, which ultimately is rooted in economic power and simple ownership of the basic facilities out of which the society is constituted.
And what of the role of the control of information and the decision-making processes?
Well, as far as control of information is concerned, it's largely dominated by a fairly small number of major sources of information. There's a number of good studies of this, but without going into the details, it's pretty narrow. And this essentially is a set of corporations, major corporations, news or information corporations, including the major television channels, which themselves are part of broader industrial and financial conglomerates, the major newspapers, half a dozen or so, which are also substantial corporations, the wire services, which are interconnected with them, and so on. These are major corporations which sell a product to other businesses. The product that they sell is audiences and readers. Newspapers and journals typically don't finance themselves through sales. In fact, they often lose money through subscribers. And obviously, if you watch a television set, you're not paying the channel. But the product that is sold is essentially readers, and what's more, elite readers. Your advertising profile rises with the audience that you can offer to the advertiser. If it's a high-quality audience in terms of privilege and buying capacity, your advertising rates go up. So the information system is fundamentally, as from an economic point of view at least, it's a system of major corporations trying to sell their product, namely relatively privileged and influential and elite audiences, to other corporations. Hence, it's all deeply embedded within the same system of domination and control that organizes and controls the economy and largely runs the state.
Is there a collective unspoken understanding of shared interest? Are there actual, the images of backroom meetings and men smoking cigars and deciding what's going to happen?
Well, of course that happens. There's nothing particularly conspiratorial about it. The same goes on in the business world. So it's not surprising to find the head of a corporation taking a business associate out to some fancy country club where they can have drinks and play golf and make business deals in the back room. In fact, that's obviously, we all know that's the way interchange. There's no sharp break between the personal and cultural interactions and business practices. So there's nothing in the least conspiratorial. These are very small groups relative to the population, very narrowly concentrated in high privilege. The values are shared, often articulated, often unspoken, and the interactions apply at every level, from Washington dinner parties to meetings of the Council on Foreign Relations, to delegations from corporate law firms to state officials, or simply the staffing of top executive positions in the government by representatives of the major investment firms, corporations, information corporations. So there's a lot of flow between the top levels of the media and the government. There's a natural interpenetration due to shared interest, shared privilege, and simply the desire to wield power effectively in the interest of the institutions one represents.
In this procedural democracy, as you've termed it in the past, do the elite view the public, the role of the public is essentially one of ratification at the polls?
That's a very conscious view. It's consciously regarded to be the duty of the public. I think it was Maxwell Taylor who once said, Kennedy's eminence gris eminence, that the role of the public is to know just enough to be able to do their duty, which is to ratify decisions at the polls. They don't have to know any more than that. And the general attitude of any system of authority towards the public is as of an enemy, because they got to be kept under control. If they get out of control, they might do all sorts of dangerous things. And typically, a state regards its domestic population as a potential enemy, and that's been notoriously true in the United States for a long time. The public is simply regarded as, well, one high Reagan official put it recently. The public, he compared the public to enemy territory. And this was in the context of the exposures of the State Department Office of Public Diplomacy, which was a state propaganda agency designed to control discussion and debate over Central America, which it succeeded in doing spectacularly. This same administration official said quite accurately, and in the context he pointed out that these spectacular achievements were the kinds of operations that one carries out in enemy territory, which is exactly right. The public is enemy territory. And this shows up in all sorts of ways. For example, at the more liberal, this happens to be the right wing, but at the more liberal end, the Trilateral Commission report on the problems of the democracies in 1975, the group around Carter, basically. In fact, the group that invented Carter, they look back nostalgically to the period when Truman had been able to govern the country with the aid of a small group of Wall Street lawyers and financiers, words approximately to that effect, an exaggeration of something that's true. And that fortunate situation, they said, is now declining because of the annoying efforts of the public to become engaged in the public arena, which have to be beaten back because that's not the role of the public. That causes a crisis of democracy. And in fact, you can trace this all the way back to the origins of the Republic. John Jay, his favorite maxim, according to his biographer, was that the people who own the country ought to govern it. And that's in fact exactly the way the constitutional system was established. It was a system in which propertied white males, who were regarded as more or less equal, inaccurately but not absurdly, they were to govern the country. In fact, they had the franchise. And as things have changed over the years with the rise of corporate power on the one hand, which restricted the possibilities of democracy, and the extension of the franchise, which theoretically extended it. This struggle between narrowly concentrated power and the enemy public has, of course, continued.
Is your societal vision outside the current state paradigm?
Well, I think the state paradigm is a very unnatural one. In fact, if you look at history, you can see that easily. To establish the state system in Europe required hundreds of years of murderous and brutal warfare. And the only reason it stopped, in fact, is that when it reached its latest stage in the early 1940s, it was plain that the next stage would be total annihilation of human civilization. And at that point, the internal conflicts in Europe terminated, at least for a time. But it was centuries of brutal warfare, murder, destruction, and so on. And that reflects the unnaturalness of the system. Everywhere where Europe has spread over the world, this, what if we were honest, we would call the plague of European civilization. Everywhere it's spread over the world, it has led to exactly the same thing. So in the colonial areas, where the European invasion imposed a version of the state system, it has also led to interminable and brutal conflict. The problems are that this system has very little to do with people's perceived interests and needs, and it therefore has to be imposed by violence and force. Now, it happens to be the governing world system at the moment, thanks to the European conquest of the world, most of the world. But in the long term, I would think it ought to be replaced by by forms of association that are more related to actual human needs and concerns. That's a long term, however.
In the United States, what kind of ingredients, what kind of conditions would be necessary for the development of an alternative, or for want of a better term, a progressive culture?
Well, talk about erosion of the state system is so far off that I don't even think it's useful to think about what would be needed. What's needed in the shorter term is exactly what elite groups fear. Anything they fear is probably good, and what they fear is what they call the crisis of democracy. That is simply the engagement of the population in the political arena. Now, the political arena is not enough, because the political arena has even engagement of the population in the political arena would be useful progress towards democracy in the United States, meaning not just sort of watching the candidates on television and clapping for them, but actually participation, real participation in formation of programs, in selection of representatives, in recall of representatives, and so on and so forth. That, which virtually doesn't exist in the United States, would be a large step towards functioning democracy. But then even if it were to be achieved in some measure, it would still be limited. The fact is that what can happen in the political system altogether, the range of decisions open in the political system, is very sharply constrained by private power. This is not a problem that arises in the United States, because the political system is so narrow and so much under business control that there are virtually never any policy options offered. But in countries that function in a more democratic fashion, where there really are policy options, say in Latin America, you see it all the time. I mean, if a reform candidate comes into office with real policy alternatives, well, there may be a military coup, but if not, there will be a capital strike, capital flight, other pressures by the owners of the society to ensure that these policies can't be pursued. Now, as I say, that doesn't really arise in the United States, because there are basically no major policy issues in the public domain. But it would happen if the political system ever opened up. And what that reflects is the fact that in a system of private enterprise, with private control over the means of production and distribution and decisions over investment and so on and so forth, in such a system, the range of political choices is restricted. heavily influenced by the resources available to those who own the basic instruments of the society, but it's also restricted simply by their capacity to control whether the society survives, how people live, and so on. And that means that meaningful democracy will involve actual popular takeover of decision-making in the essential institutions. And that includes crucially, the economic institutions. They're what determine basically what our lives are.
What do you mean by fascism? And I'm particularly intrigued by a comment you made, and I quote you, "Fascism is deeply rooted in everyone's mind in the United States."
Well, when we talk about fascism, first of all, we're talking about a system of political, economic, and social, cultural organization. If we want to talk about it reasonably, we have to dissociate it from extermination camps and gas chambers. That there was fascism before there were extermination camps, and it was bad enough then. Fascism meant in the first place, from a kind of sociocultural point of view, it meant an attack on the ideals of the Enlightenment, an attack on the conceptions of what were in those days called brotherhood of man. We would now perhaps put it in a more civilized form, but an attack on the idea that people had natural rights, that they were fundamentally equal, that it was an infringement on essential human rights if systems of authority subordinated some to others. The insistence that there were real bonds of unity and solidarity among people across cultures and so on. All of that was under attack. The ideas of solidarity were under attack under the principle of purity of race and blood, typically in the Nazi version of fascism. The economic system was to be one of class collaboration, essentially, between owners and workers, all working for the common cause, the cause of the nation and the state, under the control of a powerful state which would coordinate and intervene significantly in economic life to maintain authority, structures of power, and so on. This is connected, of course, with control by the coordinated state-private monopolies over information, extensive censorship, determination, permission for the state to determine what's true, with historical truth, to enforce those decisions, and so on. That whole range of ideas, loosely interconnected, revealed itself in the various fascist movements, which in fact spread over much of the world over the industrial world in the 1920s and the 1930s. They took various forms in different societies, but elements of them could be perceived actually virtually everywhere. And a lot of these principles, unfortunately, are very deeply rooted. So, for example, there's a very far-reaching willingness to allow the state, in coordination with private power, to control very substantial aspects of life. There's very little objection to this, whether it's cultural life, information flow, political organization, and so on. In fact, at the grassroots level in the United States, there's a lot of opposition to it. You find a lot of kind of fierce independence and individualism out among the population, but it doesn't show up much in the dominant culture, that is, the culture that actually makes decisions and controls.
You've sort of touched upon the question I was about to ask you. You've said that the non-educated classes of American society are not as indoctrinated with the state ideology as are the educated classes. Isn't that a bit romantic, and what kind of evidence do you have to substantiate that?
Well, it's not only not romantic, but it's pretty close to tautological. I mean, education is a form of indoctrination. And therefore, we typically find in any society that the educated classes are more indoctrinated. I mean, they're the ones who are subjected to the constant flow of propaganda, which is largely directed to them because they're more important, so therefore they have to be more controlled. And furthermore, the educated classes become the instruments of propaganda. Their function in the society is to promulgate and develop the ideological principles, and as a result they inculcate them. If they don't, they're usually weeded out and are no longer part of the privileged elite. So it's not at all unusual to discover the basic principles of the ideological system in any society most deeply entrenched and least critically accepted by the educated classes. Now, it would be romantic to suppose that the lesser level of indoctrination on the part of the less educated part of the population leads to some sort of revolutionary spirit or progressive impulse or whatever. It doesn't at all. It can lead to almost anything. For example, this can help create the mass base for a fascist movement. I mean, in many respects, fascist ideals are inconsistent with the demands of the elite culture and system of power and privilege. That's why, say, in the United States, you typically find the attack on real fascist tendencies led by business interests. The American Civil Liberties Union, for example, is basically a conservative organization. It's defending the kinds of rights. It's a very valuable organization. I'm glad to be part of it, but we shouldn't delude ourselves as to what it's about. I mean, it's basically defending rights which are demanded by the wealthy and the privileged. They don't want a state which is able to infringe with their privilege, and as a result, these rights are defended. You could see it last summer in the Ollie North phenomenon. There was a kind of a brief whiff of fascism there, which was detected, and you could see it in the editorials in the New York Times, or even the Wall Street Journal ran a column by its Washington correspondent lecturing to North et al. About the dangers of fascism. The business classes are quick to pick up the scent of fascism, and they don't like it because they might turn to it in a time of crisis, but typically they don't want the state to be powerful enough they want the state to work for their interests, to be powerful enough to work for their interests, but not powerful enough to infringe their privileges. So we find right at the roots of power a defense of some of the defenses against fascism. Now but the general population the uneducated, less educated, less articulate part of the population, which also is typically the most oppressed part of the population, there you can really find at times appeal by charismatic figures who promise to lead them out of their problems and to attack the either the powerful or some other boogeyman, the Jews or the homosexuals or the communists or whoever's identified as responsible for their troubles. That kind of appeal is often vivid and powerful. We've seen it plenty of times in modern society. In the United States, which is a highly depoliticized society, it's a very dangerous possibility. In particular, the growth of religious fanaticism is a very threatening phenomenon. Fortunately, the leading figures in this movement have been extremely corrupt, which is a very good thing. Every time I find that one of them wants nothing but, say, gold Cadillacs and free sex and so on and so forth, I applaud. As long as they're corrupt, they're not very dangerous. They'll just rip off their partisans. But if one of them wants power, they could be very dangerous. If someone comes along out of those movements who can combine religious fanaticism with just the lust for power, not privilege and corruption, then it could be extremely dangerous in a country like this, particularly in a period in which much of the population, poorer part of the population, may be compelled to accept a degree of austerity right now to pay off the lunacies of Reaganite economic management, but more generally, or in periods in which the decline of the power of the state, relative decline, its decline in capacity to control the world and so on, leads to all sorts of paranoid concerns about knives in the back and enemies outside and within and so on and so forth. That kind of combination does make it possible for a less indoctrinated population to deviate from the official ideology but off towards fascism. At the same time, these same groups have been and continue to be the basis for a very impressive resistance to state and corporate power and its violence. And so take, say, Central America, the sources of the rather substantial public opposition to U.S. atrocities in Central America are not in elite circles by any means. They're out in the general population, in the churches, in the Middle West, in fact, in sectors of the population that were not engaged much, may even have been hostile towards the movements of the 60s. So it's a complex affair. I mean, indoctrination, lesser indoctrination is not necessarily a hopeful phenomenon. It may be a basis for more hopeful developments, but it doesn't provide them.
In your essay, Responsibility of Intellectuals, originally published in American Power and the New Mandarins and reprinted in the Chomsky Reader, you discuss the role of intellectuals and the need to speak the truth. Steve Wasserman, in an August 1987 LA Times book review of The Reader, accuses you of not following your own advice in relation to Nicaragua. Have you muted your criticisms of the Sandinistas?
Have I muted my criticism of the Sandinistas? No, I don't think so. What exactly did you have in mind? I read the review, but I don't remember that comment.
He suggested that you were very reluctant to criticize revolutionary liberation movements in the Third World.
Oh, well, actually, that was one of the innumerable misquotations in the review. There was a section at which he took exception to, as many people do, in which I pointed out that an intellectual, like anybody else, like any human being, has the moral responsibility to consider the human consequences of what they do. That's just a truism. If you write, you have a moral responsibility to consider the consequences of what you write. What are the consequences going to be for human beings? And then I gave a number of examples, so of which he excluded because they wouldn't help with his political aims. So I said, for example, imagine a Russian intellectual now. Should that person write accurate criticism of the terror and atrocities of the Afghan resistance in the Soviet press, knowing that accurate criticism will simply help will enable the Soviet Union to mobilize the state to mobilize its own population for further atrocities and aggression? Would that be a morally responsible thing to do? I didn't answer that question, but if you want my answer, I would say no, it's not a morally responsible thing to do. That example was not mentioned. But I also pointed out that we face exactly the same point. I mean, we have to ask whether we want to act in such a way as to enhance the atrocities and violence of our own state. If I may, to take another example, suppose that I was a German citizen in 1938. Would it have been morally responsible for me to write an article in the Nazi press about the atrocities carried out by Jewish terrorists in Palestine, or about the crimes of Jewish businessmen and so on? Even if it was all accurate, would it have been morally responsible for me to write those, let's say, truths in the Nazi press? Well, I didn't answer the question there, but my own answer would be no, it would not. And these are just truisms. Now, if we're capable of recognizing the truisms about others, then we're just cowardly and dishonest if we refuse to apply the truisms to ourselves. This leads to moral dilemmas. It leads to moral dilemmas in the case of the Russian intellectual in Afghanistan, and it leads to the same moral dilemmas in the case of the American intellectual in the United States. How one resolves moral dilemmas is a problem that individuals have to face.
In the United States today, there's a good deal of awareness of and interest in Central America. There are solidarity groups, sister cities projects, delegations travel to the region. There are conferences, symposia, lectures, and a plethora of books and articles. Alex Coburn has called it a very sophisticated and mature movement. But it seems that that sophistication and maturity does not extend to the Israeli-Palestinian issue. Why not?
Well, the Israeli-Palestinian issue is, first of all, it extends to virtually, this sophistication and maturity extends to virtually nothing. The typical phenomenon is for the exactly contrary to what is always claimed. What history shows is that even the peace movement is very much controlled by the official agenda, and it has definite illusions and moral blind spots, namely about atrocities for which the United States is responsible. That's the typical phenomenon. Now, of course, that's not what you read, because the purpose of what you read is to undermine and destroy any the peace movement or anyone else. So there was a flood of propaganda, most of it fabricated, about how the peace movement has illusions and blind spots with respect to our enemies and third world dictators and so on and so forth. Exactly the opposite is very easily demonstrable. Simply to take one striking case, Timor is a perfect example. During the entire Timor atrocity, which still continues, and which is on the scale of Pol Pot and relative to the population greater, there's been almost total peace movement silence. The reason is this simply does not conform to the state agenda, since the U.S. is responsible for it. And there are numerous other examples. With regard to Central America, things have been different. And in fact, it's very striking. I mean, even just to take an indicator like, say, letters to the editor. I mean, you look around the country, and it's dramatic that letters to the editor are more sophisticated, more knowledgeable, more penetrating, more balanced, and far more accurate than the material that appears in the opinion columns, op-eds, news reports, and so on. And and I assume that the newspapers are not specifically picking letters that undermine their own position. In fact, they're obviously flooded by them, and that does reflect a difference of consciousness. But that happens to be focused on this issue for particular reasons. And the Israeli-Arab conflict, like most issues, is just outside this. There are special reasons for that. The reasons have to do largely with what happened in 1967. In 1967, about that time, Israel succeeded. First of all, it succeeded in establishing itself as what's called a strategic asset. There had been a debate, and Israel had already been regarded as a kind of strategic asset, as useful for American power, as a barrier to what was called radical Arab nationalism, meaning nationalist forces that are out of U.S. control. And 1967 established this position rather forcefully, as Israel succeeded in destroying particularly the forces of the role of Jamal Abdel Nasser in Egypt, who was the leading figure in in so-called radical Arab nationalism. Furthermore, this tremendous Israeli victory, apart from the fact that this established a considerably closer relation between Israel and U.S. elite circles, since it was doing their job for them. This becomes complex, and I don't want to oversimplify it, but that strategic asset principle was established in many circles. At the same time, there was a very interesting reaction to the Israeli victory among the intellectual elites that control the information system, liberal to right-wing in this case. There was tremendous euphoria over the Israeli victory. And Israel really endeared itself to liberal and other intellectuals at that time because of its success in using the mailed fist. And that's a phenomenon that has to be explained. I mean, it's obvious why it should be true with the ultra-right, but it's particularly interesting with regard to liberal American intellectuals, left liberal, in fact. And I think there you have to look back at American society to understand the phenomenon. It was at that point that Israel became the object of awe and love and so on. You check back, you find that until that time, even in among, say, the New York Jewish intellectuals, Israel and Zionism were pretty minor phenomena. You check back over, say, journals like, say, Dissent in earlier years. There's nothing about the topic, and in fact the editors regarded themselves as non-Zionists at the time. Well, all this changed in 1967, and I think the reason it changed largely had to do with domestic events. You have to understand what was happening in the United States at that time. In the first place, this was 1967, the United States was not succeeding in destroying the indigenous resistance in Indochina. We weren't able to defend South Vietnam, as it was put, namely destroy and attack South Vietnam. And it's important to bear in mind that liberal opinion was very strongly in favor of the war, and there was a lot of concern that the United States wasn't winning it. Well, here Israel came along and showed how to use violence against third world upstarts, and that was impressive. Furthermore, there was the failure to win the war in Vietnam was combined with a growing threat to privilege at home. Now, this came from many sectors of the society. It came from the student movement. Students were not obeying authority. They weren't. They were asking the wrong questions. There were signs of independence, intellectual independence, independent moral judgment, and so on. All of that is obviously going to be intolerable in the faculty club. There were the women's movement was barely. You could see it coming. The ethnic minorities were pressing for their rights. In fact, the crisis of democracy was beginning to develop, and all this was so. There was kind of a general sense of a threat to privilege coming from the Viet Cong, the Black Panthers, the students, the bearded Cuban revolutionaries, Maoists. I mean, all sorts of partially paranoid fantasies, but partial recognition of the reality of popular ferment threatening authority and privilege. Well, again, Israel came along and showed how to use violence effectively in restoring order, and that was an impressive demonstration. It was particularly important for liberal humanists because Israel was capable, with its very effective propaganda system, it was capable of portraying itself as being the victim, while it in fact very efficiently used force and violence to crush its enemies. And this combination is absolutely irresistible. I mean, the liberal humanist is supposed to be in favor of the victim, so they could shed tears for the victim while secretly applauding the victim's successes in the effective use of violence. That's an irresistible combination, and it stayed that way. I mean, that has swung debate in the United States to the point where sane discussion of this issue has become extremely difficult in educated circles and in the organs of communication and information that they control. There are other factors. For example, there were people, Irving Howe's the most notorious, who quite cynically exploited the passionate enthusiasm for Israel that developed in order to try to undermine and attack activist elements of the peace movement and the student movement. So he wrote vicious articles in the New York Times and elsewhere claiming that the peace movement, unidentified elements of the peace movement, wouldn't be satisfied until Israel was destroyed by bloodthirsty Arab terrorists and wanted fascism in Israel and so on and so forth. And that was an effective device at the time, an effective, I wouldn't call it McCarthyist because it goes far beyond McCarthy, but that kind of device to try to undermine the organized and activist peace movement and dissident elements. And of course, it was a very popular position. That's why it could appear in the popular among elites, which is why he could write these things in the New York Times. So that also entered. I mean, this was, of course, a period in which there was a general elite effort to try to beat back, to control the crisis of democracy, to disintegrate the popular movements that had begun to develop. And the use of Israel turned out to be one effective device that, again, strengthened the natural association between, say, the liberal intellectuals who were the commissars who were supposed to carry this out, and Israel. So for all these variety of reasons, some of them quite objective, namely the role of Israel as an actual strategic asset for the United States, some of them more complex, having to do with American culture and internal society. For these reasons, the issues were simply driven off the agenda. So, for example, here the difference between the general population and the elites is very dramatic. So polls have to be regarded a little bit cautiously, but they tell you something. Polls have indicated regularly that about something like 2/3 of the population is in favor of a Palestinian state. That's just not part of American politics. You can't find an American politician who'll call for it, and it's not part of discussion and debate. And what's striking is that even without any articulate, virtually any articulate presentation of this position, it's still the position held by a majority of the public, conforming to the international consensus that's been blocked by the United States for at least 17 years.
One question about the American left, and I know you're not terribly comfortable with using that term, but for want of a better term, you've spoken about its marginalization, its lack of resources, its lack of continuity. What about this phenomenon on the left of internecine warfare and what I call left bashing? Is that a byproduct of this marginalization?
It's partly that, and it's partly that to an extent that we don't like to recognize, external power and privilege set the agenda for the left. So, for example, a huge debate at the moment going. Take say New England Piecework, which is a Quaker-based journal and a very good journal for the local, for the New England peace movement. Well, right now it's devoting page after page to a debate which is essentially determined by the Office of Public Diplomacy. They don't recognize it. There's a debate going on every issue, with half the issue devoted to it, about whether the left, so-called, took exactly the right position with regard to Cambodia in the late 70s. Now, the fact of the matter is that the left took, such as it is, barely existing, took approximately the position that was taken by virtually all competent authorities, State Department intelligence, observers who were not just Cambodia scholarship and so on and so forth. But while at exactly the same time the left was not taking, the peace movement, let's say, was avoiding major atrocities elsewhere. Nevertheless, there's no debate going on about, let's say, the failure of the left to respond to East Timor, or the failure of the left to respond to the U.S. bombing of Cambodia in the early 1970s, which probably killed tens, if not hundreds of thousands of people, or the failure of the left to respond to the growing and already quite horrifying crisis in Central America. And there's no discussion about that. There's a discussion about the alleged failure of the peace movement to respond to Pol Pot. And in the course of that, what you find on the one side is lies, fabrication, deceit, requiring no evidence because they are the position of established power, which never requires any evidence. And then recriminations and response, any effort to response to the lies is self-destructive, because the response to the lies and exposure of the lies simply proves you're an apologist for atrocities. So it's a no-win situation, since the agenda is determined by established power. I give this example to illustrate that even the most sophisticated elements of the peace movement are trapped by the indoctrination system, and to a large extent follow its dictates. And that is another factor that leads to recrimination. In addition to that, there are just all sorts of power plays. Personal, group, and so on. Everybody who's been involved in the popular movements for years knows perfectly well that one or another sect has got their technique for trying to take control of the of any popular development that takes place. They're parasitic on it and try to bring people in and mobilize them and bring them into their own organization and their own particular cult or whatever. Sure, this is all going to go on, and as long as there are no stable and healthy popular institutions, you can anticipate that it'll continue.
Who has inspired and influenced you intellectually?
There are too many people to mention, both personal. I could mention personal examples, but that would mean going back into personal history. And in it's hard. Actually, the thing that inspires me most is exactly what inspired Rousseau, namely the sight of, I wish I could quote his words exactly, but half-naked savages fighting for their liberty and independence with courage and integrity. That's more inspiring than the writings of the sages.
Do you recognize or acknowledge the spiritual life, and is it a factor in who you are?
By the spiritual life, do you mean the life of thought and reflection and literature, or the life of religion? It's a different question.
The spiritual dimension in terms of religion, is that at all a factor?
For me, it's not. In fact, I am a child of the Enlightenment. I think irrational belief is a dangerous phenomenon, and I try to consciously avoid irrational belief. On the other hand, I certainly recognize that it's a major phenomenon for people in general. Now, whether this is something that's, and I can see, you can understand why it would be. It does apparently provide personal sustenance, but also bonds of association and solidarity, and a means for expressing elements of one's personality that are often very valuable elements. To many people it does that. In my view, there's nothing wrong with that. But my view could be wrong, of course, but that's my position. My position is we should not succumb to irrational belief.
Do you derive any strength from the Jewish tradition?
Well, I'm obviously very much part of it. I grew up deeply immersed in it and still feel that, but whether it's a source of strength, I'd find it hard to say. I couldn't identify any way in which that's true.
Who are some people today that you admire and that you learn from?
There are too many such people. I mean, I can't say. When I don't know, take my friend Reuven Zamora, for example, who's now, with tremendous courage, expressing his willingness to go back to the terror state that the United States has established in El Salvador, facing a high likelihood of assassination, and trying to exploit some political opening for his basically left Christian Democrat commitment. Well, I find that pretty inspiring. And I could think of numerous other examples. I know that's not the question you're asking, but I'm purposely evading it. I mean, there are people who've said smart things and so on, which is fine. It's not hard to say smart things.
You're in great demand as a public speaker. You're booked into the 1990s, I think. And I traveled with you in Colorado and California during the last week of January 1988. Everywhere you went, you drew appreciative and capacity audiences. Standing ovations were de rigueur. What do you attribute that to?
Well, I don't. First of all, as you know from having heard me speak, I'm not a particularly charismatic speaker. And if I had the capacity to be so, I wouldn't use it, at least, because I'm really not interested in persuading people. I don't want to persuade people, and I try to make this point obvious. What I'd like to do is help people persuade themselves. Now, I tell them what I think, and obviously, I hope that they'll persuade themselves that that's true, but I'd rather have them persuade themselves of what they think is true. I think there are a lot of analytic perspectives, just straight information that people are not presented with. And the only thing I would like to be able to contribute is that. And I think audiences, by and large, recognize that. And I think the reason people come is because that's what they want. That's what they want to hear. They want to hear that there are many people around the country, all sorts of people, who feel that they simply are not, do not have access to an awful lot of information, analysis, interpretation that is relevant to understanding the world. And I think it's a very healthy reaction to try to gain such access.
I noticed a very different Noam Chomsky when you were speaking about linguistics and philosophy. You were much more relaxed. You were given to humor. Clearly, when you're talking about the political and social issues in the other talks, it affects you.
Oh, yeah. I mean, you can't talk about the tremendous suffering that we're inflicting on other people without having a good deal of emotion either under control or actually expressed. I try to keep it under control, but it's certainly there.
You have a singular position in the intellectual life of the country today. Whether you like it or not, it's there. You're a life preserver for many people, organizations, bookstores, community radio stations. People depend on you for information and analysis, and you're a kind of intellectual axis mundi. Is that a burden? Are you comfortable?
Well, first of all, let me say that that's to the extent that that's true, it's nothing particular. It's not a particular comment about me. It's a comment about the intellectual class in general, which is simply has simply abandoned this responsibility, has abandoned the responsibility of honest inquiry and some degree of public service in favor of the pursuit of privilege and power and subordination to external power. To an overwhelming extent, that's true. There just aren't, to put it as simple as possible, there simply aren't speakers. If a group around the country wants a speaker on such and such a topic, there are very few people they can turn to. And the few people who do this are under incredible demands. That's a comment about the intellectual classes, including the left, which does not provide this kind of service to ordinary people, you might say, or it does to only a very limited extent. Any group around the country who tries to get speakers is aware of this. Is it a burden? Of course, it's both a burden and a kind of privilege. Both. It's a burden in the sense that there are 24 hours a day and only so many things you can do. So obviously, it's a burden, but it's certainly one that I would choose and do choose.
In response to questions about your prodigious work productivity, you say you are a fanatic. Do you like that about yourself?
Well, I neither like it or dislike it. I just recognize it. It does require a degree of fanaticism, simply even to be able to break out of the constant drumbeat of ideology and indoctrination, to see and simply to gain the relevant information and to organize it. Even that limited commitment requires a degree of fanaticism. And to pursue it beyond that, to, say, constant travel, speaking, etc., well, sure, that's another form of fanaticism.
Is it too early to talk about where you see yourself and your work?
Well, I see myself in these areas, as far as I'm aware. I know what I'm trying to do. Others can judge how well it's done. What I'm trying to do is simply provide the kind of service to popular dissident movements and, in fact, scattered individuals that any person who has the resources, the privilege, the training, and so on should perform. Nothing beyond that.
You were just listening to Conversations with Noam Chomsky, Part 2. Conversations with Noam Chomsky is produced by Alternative Radio, an independent production company. Alternative Radio produces programs featuring Alexander Coburn, John Stockwell, Michael Parenti, Daniel Shore, Edward Said, and many others.